Story number one. I like to hike in the woods that surround my town, usually late at night when everything is quiet. Sometimes I hike so late that I'll end up staying long enough to watch the sunrise. It's peaceful most of the time, just me and nature. But one night I stumbled across something that still gives me chills to this day. It must have been well past midnight when I found it. I had wandered deeper into the woods than I usually go, exploring paths that I hadn't seen before. The moon was high, casting long shadows between the trees, and everything was eerily silent. No animals rustling, no insects buzzing. It was the kind of stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That's when I saw it. In a small clearing, hidden deep within the trees, was what I can only describe as a shanty town. There were several makeshift structures, hovels cobbled together from scraps of metal, old bed sheets, and random junk. Some were simple lean-tos propped up against trees, while others were more enclosed, like tiny shelters that looked as though someone had tried to make a home out of them. A small fire pit sat in the middle of the camp, its edges lined with the remnants of an old tire that someone had repurposed to contain the flames. And strangest of all, the fire was still burning. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was strange enough to find this place so deep in the woods, but the fact that the fire was still going unsettled me. Fires take effort. Someone had been there recently, maybe even within the last hour, and they had left it burning, unattended in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. I looked around the camp, expecting to see people, maybe a group of drifters or travelers. From the size of the camp, it looked like it could hold at least a dozen people, maybe more. There were small personal belongings scattered around, worn-out blankets, some mismatched shoes, and what looked like a makeshift cooking pot resting on a stone. But there wasn't a single soul in sight. The whole place was as quiet as a grave, as if everyone had just vanished into thin air. I stood there, listening for any signs of movement, anything that would suggest someone was nearby. But there was nothing, not even the distant snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, just the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional pop from the burning wood. The silence pressed down on me, and a feeling of unease began to creep in. It felt like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I took a few steps closer to one of the shanties, curious but wary. Inside, I saw what looked like someone's bed, a few ratty blankets spread over a bundle of clothes with a plastic water bottle lying beside it. Whoever had been staying there had left in a hurry. There was no attempt to pack anything up, no sign of a departure. It was as if they had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind without a second thought. The strange part wasn't just the emptiness. It was the way the camp felt abandoned mid-action, as if whoever had been there planned to come back at any moment. Fires like that don't burn forever. Someone had tended it, fed it wood, and kept it alive. And yet, for some reason, they were gone. I stood there a little longer, scanning the area, hoping to catch some clue as to what had happened. The only thing I found was an eerie, nagging feeling in my gut. The kind you get when you know you're being watched, even though no one's there. I suddenly felt very exposed, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant for me. The fire still burning, the personal belongings scattered without care. It was unsettling in a way I can't fully explain. I thought about sticking around to see if anyone came back, but the longer I stayed, the more the unease grew. It felt like something was off, like the camp wasn't just abandoned, it was avoided. Whatever or whoever had been there, I had no desire to meet them. So I turned back toward the path, leaving the fire and the empty shanties behind. I've gone back to those woods many times since, but I've never gone as deep as I did that night. Whatever was going on out there, I could never figure it out. Story number two. When I was younger and a lot dumber, I went to college in the North Georgia mountains. My friends and I used to go night hiking on the trails around campus all the time. We loved it. The isolation, the adventure, and the thrill of being out in the wilderness when everything else was quiet. Over time, I got really familiar with the trails, maybe a little too confident in my ability to handle being out there alone at night. One night, the full moon was out, casting everything in a soft, dim blue glow. It was one of those perfect nights, clear skies, just cool enough to feel refreshing, and visibility was incredible under the moonlight. I was a little stoned, but not blitzed, and feeling restless. My friends weren't around, and I love doing adventurous stuff on my own, so I decided to head out for a solo night hike. I grabbed a flashlight just in case, but this was back in 2002. No cell phones or GPS. It wasn't the smartest decision, but at the time, it seemed like no big deal. I picked an easy trail that looped for about a mile. It was flat, peaceful, and not too remote, though far enough from campus that it felt secluded. It wasn't a national park or anything official, just a rural area with some well-worn paths. At first it was perfect, walking under the moonlight with the shadows stretching long and the trees glowing silver in the dim light. I didn't even need my flashlight. The whole thing felt serene, like I'd stumbled into a dream. About halfway through the loop, though, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just this feeling of unease that crept in like a cold breeze. My instincts were telling me something wasn't right. A second later, I heard it. A man's voice, somewhere off in the woods ahead of me. He was crying. The sound froze me in my tracks. It wasn't a normal kind of crying. It was distant but desperate, like someone on the verge of breaking down completely. At first, I thought maybe it was someone lost or hurt. I'm the kind of person who usually wants to help. 99.9% of the time, I'd call out or offer assistance. But this time, every alarm bell in my body was going off. The crying wasn't just sad, it was wrong. The way the man sobbed felt off, like he was teetering on the edge of sanity. It wasn't just crying, he was almost babbling, like someone who's been screaming for hours but lost the strength to continue. There was this sharp, shrill undercurrent to the sound, as if he was barely holding in a scream. It was relentless, going on and on without pause, like a broken mine stuck on repeat. I remember standing there, my heart pounding in my chest, my body stiff with fear. I almost called out. I came so close, but it was like my voice refused to work. Some deep, primal part of me knew that whatever was happening out there, I needed to stay silent. If I made a sound, if he realized I was listening, something terrible would happen. The crying continued, coming from somewhere off to the right of the trail, just far enough that I couldn't see anything through the trees. My stomach twisted with fear, like a cold knot forming deep inside me. I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, as quietly as I could, I turned back the way I came. Every step measured and deliberate. It felt like my senses had gone into overdrive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under my boots sounded deafening. I kept expecting the crying to change, like it would get louder or turn into an angry, crazed scream if I made too much noise. The silence of the forest around me felt suffocating, like the whole world was holding its breath. I must have walked a mile, but it felt like I was moving in slow motion. With every step, the crying faded just a little more, but I didn't relax, not even when it was finally out of earshot. My brain kept telling me that any second now the man would come crashing through the trees, wild-eyed and furious. I pictured him lunging out of the darkness, dragging me down into the woods where no one would ever find me. When I finally made it back to my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors so fast it was like I was racing death itself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. Even as I sat there with the engine running, headlights on, and the doors locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching from the tree line. The drive back to campus was a blur. It was like my body didn't know how to come down from the fear. It just kept replaying the sound of that crying over and over in my head. There's a part of me, even years later, that tells me I was lucky to walk away from that trail. Story number 3, I like going for walks late at night. I've had a few strange encounters over the years, but the creepiest happened about 2 months ago. It still unsettles me when I think about it. That night I left the house around 1:30 a.m. It was just a regular walk, no destination in mind, just wandering around the town. Everything was still and empty, the streets bathed in that eerie yellow glow from the streetlights. I strolled for a while, letting my thoughts wander as I enjoyed the solitude. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to head home. I retraced my steps, taking the same route I'd used earlier. That's when I first noticed the black van. It rolled down the street slowly, Not exactly suspicious at first, but slow enough to catch my attention. I figured it was just someone driving late at night and didn't think much of it. I kept walking, listening to my footsteps echo in the silence. A few minutes later, I saw the same black van drive by again, following the same path. This time it passed me more slowly, like the driver was checking me out. I told myself it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe someone was lost or looking for an address. But that sinking feeling of unease crept into my gut, the kind you get when you know something's not right. I decided to keep walking but started paying closer attention. 10 minutes later, I spotted the van again, moving down the street in my direction. That's when I knew for sure it was the same one. No license plates, just an unmarked, dark van rolling quietly through the streets at 2 a.m., like it had no business being there. My heart started to race, and I picked up my pace without breaking into a full run. I didn't want to make it obvious I'd noticed, but the van came back a fourth time, and this time it stopped. Right in the middle of the street, just a few houses ahead of me. The engine hummed quietly in the night, and the headlights cast long shadows down the empty road. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Were they following me, waiting for me to get closer? The fear hit me hard, and I decided right then and there. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned on my heel and started walking quickly in the opposite direction. I didn't run yet, just fast enough to put some distance between me and that van without looking suspicious. My mind kept screaming, "Don't look back, just move." The sound of my own footsteps seemed too loud, too exposed, like whoever was inside the van could hear every step I made. I made a sharp left turn down a side street, hoping to lose them. But the street was empty and quiet, and every second that passed felt like an hour. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the same van again. It was cruising slowly down the next street over, like it was looking for me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. They were definitely following me now. There was no more room for doubt. I knew I had to get off the streets. If they saw me again, I had no idea what would happen, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I made another sharp turn, ran down the block, and darted into someone's yard. I crouched behind their fence, pressing myself into the shadows, trying to stay as small and quiet as possible. My lungs burned from running, but I forced myself to stay still. Then right on cue, the black van rolled by again, moving slowly down the street, just a few feet from where I was hiding. I could see the silhouette of the driver through the window, but the streetlight made it hard to make out any details. I held my breath, hoping to God they wouldn't stop or notice me. I watched as the van kept going, disappearing into the distance. Even though it seemed like they were gone, I stayed hidden behind the fence for what felt like an eternity, probably about 20 minutes, just to be sure. My pulse refused to slow down, and every little sound felt like the van coming back. When I was finally sure they weren't coming back, I got up and sprinted toward my house. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just wanted to be inside and away from the streets. By the time I reached my house, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the window open. I didn't even bother with the door. I threw the window up, crawled inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I sat on the floor of my room, catching my breath, every muscle in my body trembling from the adrenaline. I stayed there for a long time, just listening for any sign that the van had come back. But the streets outside were silent, and eventually the fear started to fade. I still don't know what the hell that was all about, but I've never felt fear like that since. It's literally burned into my memory. Story number 4. One night a few years ago, my friends and I decided it would be cool to hike to the top of a small mountain to watch a meteor shower. There were 4 of us, all about 16 years old at the time, 3 guys and 1 girl. We thought it would be an adventure, something fun to do at night, so we grabbed some snacks, piled into a car, and drove to the trailhead. The hike itself wasn't too bad. It was a pretty short trail, just steep enough to feel like a good workout. We were excited, chatting and joking around as we climbed under the glow of the stars. About halfway up, we stopped to catch our breath and take a break. That's when we noticed him. There was a man on the trail behind us, maybe 30 or so, wearing a business suit, a full-on suit, in the middle of the night, in the woods. It was strange, to say the least. We exchanged a few glances, trying to figure out if we should be worried. Who hikes up a mountain at night alone in a suit? But we tried to shrug it off. Maybe he had come straight from some weird late-night event. Or maybe it was just one of those random things you see every now and then. Still, the weirdness of it settled in, and we decided to keep moving. We didn't run or anything, but we picked up the pace, hoping to put some distance between us and him. But after a while, when we stopped again to drink some water, we realized he was still there. And this time, he was only about 10 feet away. We tried to stay calm, figuring if we just waited, he'd walk by and leave us alone. But instead, he stopped. With a smile, he asked us if we were hiking to watch the meteor shower and if he could walk with us. None of us knew what to say. It was such a weird request, but it didn't feel like something we could outright refuse. So trying to play it cool, we nodded and told him he could join us. As we started walking again, though, things got even stranger. My friend and I noticed that the man was walking uncomfortably close to our friend, the only girl in the group. And I don't mean just walking near her. He was close enough that it seemed like he was practically smelling her shampoo, leaning in just a little too much every time she moved. My stomach knotted with unease. Something was very wrong. We kept going, but the atmosphere had shifted. The excitement we'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense that we needed to get away from this guy. We reached the top of the trail and found a spot to sit and watch the meteor shower. But instead of giving us space, the man plopped down almost right on top of our friend, practically pressing against her side. You could see the discomfort on her face, but none of us knew how to handle it without escalating the situation. I glanced at my friend, and he gave me that we need to leave look. Thinking fast, I made up some excuse, something about needing to leave early because of curfews, and said we had to get back down. Our friend immediately jumped up, grateful for the out, and we all followed suit. The man just sat there for a second, smiling in this weird, unsettling way. Then he stood up slowly and said, "I'll walk with you guys." That's when we knew we had to get the hell out of there. We didn't even try to play it cool this time. We practically sprinted down the trail, adrenaline kicking in as fear gripped all of us. When we finally made it back to the car, we piled in as fast as we could, slamming the doors shut and locking them. For a brief moment, we thought we were safe. We sat there catching our breath and laughing nervously, relieved that we'd ditched the weirdo. But just as we were about to pull out of the parking lot, one of my friends pointed toward the trailhead. There he was, the same guy, sprinting down the trail toward us, full speed, clutching a large stick in his hand. Panic hit us all at once. My friend fumbled with the keys and the car roared to life just as the man reached the edge of the lot. He kept coming, charging straight toward the car. We peeled out of there, tires screeching as we sped away. None of us said a word for a long time, too shaken to process what had just happened. When we were finally a safe distance away, we tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that it had to be drugs. Maybe the guy was high out of his mind, or maybe he was just some bizarre thrill seeker. Either way, we were just grateful we got out of there when we did. But 2 days later, everything changed. One of us got a text message with a link to a news article. The story was about a man who had strangled his wife earlier that night, on the same day we had been hiking. After killing her, he had attacked another woman on a nearby trail, killing her too. It was him, the same guy we'd met on the trail that night, the man in the suit. The realization hit us like a truck. That man hadn't just been some strange hiker or a guy on drugs, he was a killer, and we'd barely escaped with our lives. To this day, I can't shake the thought of how close we came to becoming part of that news story. We never told our parents what happened, and we never went back to that trail again. Ever. Story number 5. It was around 1 a.m. and my dog rang the bell we keep by the door. Her way of telling me she needed to go out. I groaned but knew I had to get up. When she wants to go out in the middle of the night, I don't take her far, just to the side yard so she can do her business. I grabbed a flashlight in case she decided to poop, and we headed outside. I stood there half asleep, waiting for her to finish. She started doing her usual thing, sniffing the ground and circling around like dogs do before they find the perfect spot. Everything was quiet, just the faint rustle of leaves in the green belt behind our house. That's when things got strange. Out of nowhere, my dog froze. Her ears perked up and she whipped around, staring toward the dark space between our house and the neighbors. I flicked the flashlight over in that direction, and that's when I saw her, a young woman, maybe around 20, standing dead still. I didn't hear her walk up. I didn't see her approach. She was just there, standing like she'd been waiting, watching. The odd part was where she came from, right between my house and the neighbors. But that made no sense. Behind both of our houses was a green belt, a thick patch of trees and brush. There was no reason for anyone to be back there at this hour. The temperature was hovering around 40 degrees, but she was wearing just a t-shirt and super short shorts, as if it were the middle of summer. She looked at me with a vacant expression, and I was too startled to say anything at first. I finally managed, "You scared me." She barely reacted, mumbling something like, "Nice night, huh? What are you up to?" I glanced down at my dog's leash, still trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Just walking my dog," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. She gave a strange smile and said, "Cool, cool. Do you know how to get into my house?" I locked myself out. Then she pointed at my neighbor's house. Now I know my neighbors pretty well. The woman who lives next door is in her 30s, single, and she and my wife are good friends. I've spent plenty of time chatting with her, and I knew right away that this wasn't her. This stranger didn't look even remotely familiar. "You mean that house?" I asked, pointing at my neighbor's place. She nodded without hesitation. "Yeah," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I gave her a hard look. "You don't live there. I know who lives there." She let out this little scoff, like she was annoyed I'd figured it out. Then, without another word, she wandered into my backyard. At this point, I was done playing nice. I followed her, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What the hell are you doing?" I called after her, heart pounding in my chest. Before I could stop her, she bolted. Out of nowhere, she sprinted toward the back fence. Now, this isn't just any fence, it's a deer fence. The bottom part is cattle gate, about 3 feet high, and the top half is thin stainless steel wire that runs horizontally. It's practically invisible in the dark, and anyone unfamiliar with it would trip for sure. But not her. She scaled that thing like it was nothing, barely breaking stride. 1 second she was on the ground, the next she was over the fence and disappearing into the green belt beyond it. I stood there stunned, flashlight beam scanning the trees. She was already gone. I kept my cool as best I could and checked around the yard, my neighbor's yard, and the edge of the green belt. I shined my flashlight in every direction, half expecting to see her lurking somewhere in the shadows. But there was nothing. No sign of her, no explanation for where she came from or what she wanted. My dog, who's usually quick to bark at strangers, was completely useless during the whole thing, just standing there, tail wagging like nothing strange had happened. I had my pocket knife on me, but even with that, I felt completely rattled. It's not every day someone shows up in the middle of the night, claiming to live next door, only to run off like a damn sprinter into the forest. I have no idea what her intentions were or why she was there. Whatever her plan was, she scared the ever-living hell out of me. Story number 6. It was summer, just around dusk, and my dad and I were out camping at a remote campground. The place was quiet, tucked away from any crowds, and there was a beautiful lake right beside the campgrounds. One of our favorite things to do on these trips was to hike along a rough trail by the lake, pushing through the underbrush to find a waterfall deep in the forest. That evening, we decided to make the trek again. The path wasn't marked, but we knew the general direction. Just keep following the lake, and eventually we'd reach the waterfall. The hike started off normal enough, with the familiar sounds of birds and the occasional splash from the lake. But as we got deeper into the forest, things started to feel off. The first weird thing we came across was a slash pile, just a messy heap of branches, leaves, and cut wood, the kind you might see after someone clears an area. Right on top of the pile, though, was a tiny kid's shoe. That gave me pause. There were no other campers nearby, no families with kids that we had seen, and it made no sense for a shoe to be out here, balanced so strangely on top of a brush pile. My dad just shrugged it off, saying maybe someone had dropped it on an earlier hike. But the sight of that little shoe gave me a weird feeling I couldn't shake. We kept going, though, making our way toward the waterfall. Eventually, we came to a small clearing in the trees. My dad said he needed to take a leak, so we stood on opposite sides of the clearing, him facing one way, me the other. As I waited, the air felt unusually still, like the forest was holding its breath. Then out of nowhere, we both heard a small, clear voice. "I'm over here!" My dad whipped his head around to look at me, and I turned to him just as fast. His face had gone pale. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice tight. "I didn't say anything," I replied, heart pounding. He stared at me for a moment, then scanned the clearing with wide eyes. We both knew what we had heard, a child's voice, plain as day, and it hadn't come from me. Convinced that maybe a kid was lost in the woods, we spent the next half hour searching the surrounding area, calling out, looking under bushes, and checking behind trees. But there was no one. No child, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. Just the silence of the forest. Eventually we gave up and decided to head back toward camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and we both felt uneasy. The sense of peace that had been with us earlier was long gone, replaced by a heavy feeling of being watched. We hadn't gone far before we started hearing sounds from behind us, branches snapping, bushes rustling, and the distinct crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Something was following us. We stopped a couple of times, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but every time we turned around, the sound stopped. There was nothing there. We started walking faster, glancing over our shoulders every few seconds, and the footsteps kept pace with us, never too close, but always just within earshot. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and I knew my dad was just as spooked as I was, though he tried to keep calm. Every now and then, he'd mutter things like, "Probably just an animal," or "must be the wind." But we both knew that didn't explain what we were hearing. By the time we reached the campground, it was almost dark. The sounds had stopped once we got near the tents and fire pit, but neither of us said anything about it. We packed up in silence, both pretending everything was normal. Though I knew we were both shaken. We haven't gone back to that campsite since. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.